crises of this nature are often opportunities to impose greater social restrictions, but similarly they're an opportunity to bring about social change. What are you observing so far?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the words you use, I think, are striking, actually, the new normal, because I think we have to recognise this is going to be a new normal, that it's going to have a profound impact in ways that we certainly not anticipate or certainly can't understand fully yet. I think, we do have to be very mindful of history. And I think one thing that we know historically is the way in which these kind of crises do have a fundamental reordering of the nature of politics. Now, I don't know, without dwelling too much on the history, I do think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the big major changes in the history of the human condition have actually come in responses to pandemics. So if you look, for instance, at, first of all, the Black Death, when that swept right across Europe, for many people, actually, that's the birth of anti-Semitism in Europe, because Jewish people were actually blamed for actually bringing the Black Death from the Far East. And there's a very famous massacre in 1349, which was called the Valentine's Massacre, which happened in France, which went through when 3,000 Jewish people were burned. Now, that in itself, of course, the legacy of anti-Semitism from that point onwards. I do also think, if we look at then the birth of the modern societies, I know you mentioned biopolitics quite a bit in your recent post. Foucault argues that the birth of the modern state begins in response to the plague and how we need to understand and regulate and control human life. So I do think that, having a rich appreciation, first of all, of the history of pandemics is something which will perhaps guide us better into the future. Now, in terms of where we're going from this, I think you're absolutely right. We seem to be at a bit of a crossroads in our history and an appreciation in our history where we could kind of go in two different directions. The one is quite clearly a shift towards a certain creep in authoritarianism, where these temporary security measures become permanent, and that's something we need to be very alert to. The alternative might be a much more enriched planetary awakening, an ethical awakening, that makes us fully appreciative of those who are truly vulnerable in our societies. And I think if anything that this virus has done, it's made us all kind of feel a sense of maybe what we might call a mutually assured vulnerability. But also it's bringing into clear focus the people who are truly vulnerable in our societies. And there is that kind of saying, the one thing that crises truly reveal is what's already broken in a society. And it brings this clearly into focus. And the one thing we are seeing today is, these issues around food insecurity, health insecurity, things which many people are living with on a daily basis and which we're all now kind of having to come to terms with. And if we can kind of harness that feeling, that sentimentality, that surely can be the start point for rethinking of a new kind of politics.
What have you seen in the actions and edicts of the governing that gives an indication of the sort of attitudes to because I suppose when you say that Foucault thing about like you could say that the relationship with the state begins with the pandemic, that sort of suggests that it's a kind of a reinforcement of the dynamic of the governed and the governing, that we require a sovereign when we are vulnerable. We're more likely to ascribe to a kind of to state control, or submit rather to state control in times of vulnerability. What do you think about the sort of like the response of various countries, and what can we read into the response of Australia, the response of New Zealand, the response of our country, and the response of America? Is there anything that you think is sort of a kind of, I don't know, a litmus test or barometer of certain attitudes towards power and the people that they govern?
Yeah, well, I think that the responses have been varied. I think if we were going to be critical, certainly the US and the UK approach in particular was not so much just kind of putting the head in the sand, but trying to ensure as much as possible that business as usual. And it seems that the profit motive was the overriding concern, and the profit above people. That became very clear in the early responses to this crisis. And, we don't want to start saying, well, there's a negligence there, but certainly more should have been done at the level of people instead of profits. Now, what could we have done differently? Well, I know there's been a lot of calls for people saying, well, just simply introduce a basic universal wage for people. So people don't have to worry about, we often find monies when we need to reinforce the military or when we need to bail out the banks. But it's, the numbers are insignificant when we think about actually just giving, everybody in the world a basic universal living wage, which would mitigate against all the economic concerns we're currently having. Now, I know like certain countries like Denmark, for instance, have now come out and said they're going to pay 80% of people's wages, right, during this crisis. Now, okay, this is great in time of crisis, but why not think about this beyond that? Nobody should have to live with these immediate conditions of vulnerability where a crisis like this can have so many people feeling so desperate in terms of, and we have no idea of the mental health, the lasting effects of the mental health issues concerning all of this kind of state of vulnerability that people are now in. So I think in terms of that response, that's clear. The other side of things in terms of then, what I find particularly deeply troubling about the politicians' responses at the minute is this now complete fallback onto war metaphors, that we are now at war with an invisible enemy. And this narrative of war, to me, is very dangerous because, first of all, it normalizes militarism. It gives over to the exception can now become the rule. And in that sense, of course, this idea that we're fighting some invisible killer, this becomes something which really embeds down on security. And your point about then, okay, we need the sovereign state, okay, we can say, well, what is the purpose of security? Well, to protect its citizens, right? But protecting citizens in this context surely has to be the protection of global citizens, not the protection of some nations' citizens over others. But we have to go further than this, because this idea now, and I think this is one of the things that's also becoming apparent to us in this time, is that this idea that politics begins with security is complete misnomer. Politics begins with our concern for our loved ones, for our families, for our friends. So before we even give any sense of meaning to security, we need to know what love means. We need to know what compassion means. We need to know what empathy means, because that's what brings security really into focus for us. So in that sense, of course, politicians are going to the war metaphor, talking about security. What we need to be talking about much more richly is, what does community now mean in the 21st century? Now we face these kind of crises, and to take seriously an idea of a politics of love, because that's what's been completely missing from the world up until now.
Thank you. The one of the, I'm sure you're aware of the sort of heartening, spontaneous community actions that are emerging, people taking meds to vulnerable neighbours and making sure that people have got food in their community. These principles of self-organisation are being deployed, and these are grassroots movements, not directed by certainly not by the state, and I don't even think by any kind of big charity organisations. I'm sure there are things, but what sort of strikes me as interesting is the way that people are intuitively mobilising. You said earlier about that crisis reveals what's already broken, and I think it's, for me, has been interesting to see how many of the things that we take for granted are in fact conceptual, held together by faith-based structures, whether that's sort of our entire national economies or significant transnational enterprises like airlines, that everything is sort of, that these houses are all made of straw, that once you stop investing, that if the economy slows down, it can't be sustained or withstood, or a crisis cannot be withstood, precisely because of the revelation of a kind of detachment. And so there's not, when you talk about politics of love, what I feel like is, that's the way that that's critiqued is always as if it's mawkish, sentimental, kind of unintellectual. But actually, it's this, as you say, it's kind of the deepest reality we experience. One of the things I'm curious about, Brad, is how people will, in 12 weeks or 16 weeks, assuming that this is successfully managed in spite of the obvious sort of tragedy and disruption that it's causing, do you think that people are going to just willingly go back to their jobs, or can you envisage a kind of geological stratification, like this point of time is running through all of our consciousness, this moment when we all stopped working, all stopped consuming, all stopped travelling? Can you see that a further positive impact emerging?
Well, I think that the geological will certainly be out of our control, in the sense of we have to insist upon governments that this doesn't actually create permanent isolation, permanent planetary. Because the one thing actually that the virus has shown is that borders actually really don't matter. Now, populations for us, we can kind of say, well, okay, we need these temporary lockdowns, but what we surely need going forward actually is the opening up of all borders, because to combat these kind of viruses, we need truly global cooperation. These kind of issues affect us all, and we need to have a much more rigorous understanding. Where I do think we might have a hope, a more profound shift, is in the ecological conditions of life. We're all now living in what we might effectively call a climate of fear, a climate of anxiety, a climate of insecurity. And those ecological conditions of life, how we make sense of the atmospheres in which we are now living in, how we look forward in 12 weeks' time, there is a danger that atmosphere could become very toxic. We could be looking for blame, we could be looking for scapegoats, we could be looking for... Whereas actually, if we kept hold of how we're feeling now, and we talk about, you say this kind of idea of the politics of love as being very sentimental. There's nothing sentimental about the current condition in which we're living, And what we are seeing is people actually recognizing this is really where we're at. And I think this is perhaps part of the surrealism of it as well, because I often find myself watching the news, and it's kind of, I don't know how healthy this is sometimes to watch the 24-hour news coverage, right? Because you yourself become more and more, you see the news presenters are equally trying to just grapple with what the hell's going on without any answers, and they're looking just as worried as anybody else. Often the news reporters are meant to reassure you the things that are actually not so bad, right? But you see in their faces, they're looking more and more anxious, more insecure about things. And the thing that I find surreal is like, I've almost seen this before, but it's been on Hollywood. We've seen we've lived this reality before in a simulacrum, what Baudrillard would call a simulacrum. But now we're actually living it, and we know it's real, and we know it's certain. And how we can mobilize that going forward, I think, will be absolutely crucial to preventing not only these kinds of outbreaks happening again, because they might happen again, but how we respond to them better, but to ensure that the world doesn't become more fragmented as a result of it. And I think that's the real danger.
Well, one question I've been thinking about is the balance between centralized power and the necessity for there to be centralized response. It seems like in medicine, the judiciary, I don't know, law and order, and the sort of absence of community that has preceded this crisis, and the sort of long-term castration of most of us, the lack of civic life, that Hannah Arendt quote that in the sort of post-Enlightenment thinking led to the end of civil discourse, and that we're now, whilst we appear together in public, we're just sort of living our private lives in public. There's no sense that we're holding communities together, that we're engaged in the sustenance and survival of our group, community or tribe. I'm interested in, people, when I talk about like anarcho-syndicalism, we should live more tribally, we should live in groups of 150 that are completely democratic and self-governing, a kind of confederacy, and people say, no, there needs to be more centralisation so that you can respond to a crisis of this nature. Where do you fall in that debate, and what complexities are there that I'm missing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think centralization of power is never a good thing. I think what matters more, as you actually rightly point out, I think, Russell, is what type of communities and cultures are produced through the organization of certain regimes of power. Now, what I mean by that, of course, we know across the world that sometimes some of the most vibrantly caring and rich social communities registered as the poorest economically. People still look out for one another. People still care for one another. It's what the critical development theorist Mark Duffield has called actually existing development. Right, so people still actually care for one another despite the hardship, because they know they can rely on one another. Now, one thing we've found, and there's been many studies done about the ways in which our capitalist, individualist societies have destroyed notions of community. And maybe this is one of the realizations which is now biting us back. It's kind of saying, because I was watching the news earlier, and there was this old lady chatting on there and saying her biggest fear is dying alone. And this idea of dying alone, but we have, created societies which are premised on notions of alienation, based on individualization, based on, I'll be okay, Jack, right? But because I'm in a competition and I need to look after myself. And in that sense, I think what this kind of is revealing is how much we are at just the very basic level of the human condition so dependent on one another that we cannot live as an island. And we have to kind of, recognize this. And that has to be perhaps the start lesson. It's almost like a crash course for us now in the need for community. And I think that is, it shouldn't be a revelation to us, but it is a revelation that we're having to encounter once again.
It's a firm anthropological slap that we've received, a kind of stark reminder that we've embedded ourselves in these individualized systems when for hundreds of thousands and in some form millions of years we've lived as tribal, communal animals. And now in our pristine cells of comfort, wherever we fall on the social spectrum, perhaps there are nasty little cells of discomfort if we're economically underserved. Now what do we do when the rules change? I wonder, Brad, I speculate sometimes on what, when a decision's made, for example, I was talking to a friend who, because of course we're all experts in coronavirus now. I was talking to a friend and he said that it was interesting that Boris Johnson recommended that small businesses, restaurants, etc. closed rather than mandated that they closed. If they closed, they would be able to claim insurance. If they don't do that, if it's not mandated, they can't claim insurance, and that's sort of another indication of the attitude that underwrites policy. There is more revelation there about who is being served, and of course, in this crisis, the conservation of the system itself will be a priority. I wonder what kind of concerns there are of civil unrest. I wonder what kind of concerns there are about people utilising this crisis as an opportunity to bring about social change, to present new ideas, to confront people with, well, look at your reality, look at how we were living, the sort of the drudgery of what your mate Paul calls like lanyard slavery or whatever, like indentured lanyard servants, people just in and out of city office blocks. It's. For me, it's, of course, there are beautiful things. The community spirit is revealed, and our care for one another and our love for one another. But also, there's something I feel being taught about the essential nature of our systems and what is prioritised. And I suppose I'm asking, do you not getting into conspiracy territory, but do you imagine that there are quite fearful conversations taking place in high levels of government about what this could be sort of a pivotal point for civil unrest and change?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, 2 points on there, Russell. I think the first point actually you make, and I think we shouldn't actually get away from this actually, first of all, is insurance, right? Because I think one of the clearest mechanisms for what does it mean to be secure in our current system? Well, it means to have insurance, right? The ability to so-called bounce back from catastrophes and crisis. But we know the most vulnerable people who are prone to catastrophe and crisis can never get the premiums they need, right? So that is the irony of, those who can afford it can pay for the insurance, even though they're less likely to ever succumb to the types of catastrophes. And I think, so that in itself, there's a clearly hidden politics, even to the very idea of insurance. And that shows how economized our understanding of security clearly is, right? Now, in terms of the civil unrest question, again, I think we need to look, one of the things which has been very striking, it has been the remarkable dignity which a lot of people have been showing. There's the panic buy-in stuff, and you can say, okay, there's something which is completely not right about that, but I think some of the panic buy-in is understandable, just because of the way in which the government has been badly managing even the public announcements in terms of, so some of that panic buy-in is, it's easier to deride people who panic buy, but, people are really deeply concerned. So, okay, we can understand some of the logics of that, even if we don't agree with it. To me, if we look historically, however, like for instance, if you look in a recent case in a few years back in Haiti, when there was the major disaster there. There was only genuine civil unrest in Haiti after they militarized the streets. So it's almost like by militarizing the streets, you invite a counter protest, because people then go from feeling like I'm going to self-isolate because there's a catastrophe going on, to now feeling actually I'm now living in a military state. And I think the danger for civil unrest and protest will come in the real face of physical symbols of violence on the street, which is militarization. And I think that's where then there might be a danger that people will start to realize there's something more at work politically here, and we are simply not happy with this. And I think that's where there might be a danger in the kind of dynamic taking place there.